You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
In this episode, I got myself, Nick, and we got my co-host, Lisa. What is going on, Lisa? How are you?
Going well. Looking very forward to this one.
Hell yeah. So it's always a great show when we got Justin in. It's always solid, and he brings receipts. I'm very much looking forward to this. And as you can see in the title, yes, we got LDS abuse, Justin back on the show. And we got Mormon money magic this time. And I think this will be really interesting for people to see. And yeah, just pay attention. I think he's got a lot to show us. Justin, what is up? What's going on? Thank you very much for coming on. And let everybody know what your deal is and where they can find your stuff, please.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me on again today, guys. So pretty easy to find me. I'm on Twitter as @LDS Abuse, and I have kind of a crazy website called https://ldsabuse.info that people are welcome to go spend time digging through the resources and research over there. I always joke that I would avoid the blog because that's just me ranting and raving, and so. But we do have some good pages out there with some good research and good resources, including documents related to Mormonism and CIA and Mormonism and abuse. So yeah, today we are going to talk about a man by the name of David Kennedy. And this has been probably the most information-dense dive that I've done. And it's really interesting because a lot of my research started with a woman by the name of Beverly Campbell, who we talked about last time. But I think what I realized here is that Beverly Campbell's entire involvement is really probably through David Kennedy. And David Kennedy, I think, is going to be a real linchpin in this entire conversation. So before I get to the timeline today's chronology, though, I just want to chat really quickly about why. So we chose this, Mormon money magic name for the show today. And it's something that I'm learning about. I have a couple people who are really trying to get me up to speed on this. But I do want to just address it really quickly because I think inside of Mormonism, you have this very strange marriage of occultism and pragmatism, right? Like you've got like a bunch of occultism, especially all the way back with Joseph Smith being a treasure digger, right? He has all kinds of like occult, and so the church will present it as folk magic, right? They'll say, oh, it's just something everybody was doing. But the more that I look at the artifacts and the more that I look at the documents, the more that I really think what we're talking about is like Scottish Rite occult Freemasonry, right? Or esoteric Freemasonry, as I think is what it's called officially. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in today's presentation when we talk about David Kennedy and a guy by the name, and I'm not going to know how to pronounce a lot of this today, guys. I apologize. So just correct me if I get it wrong. But it's Sindona, right? And so Sindona was known as God's banker, and he was interfacing between the CIA and the Vatican. And David M. Kennedy was a part of that. And part of Sindona is that he was a Freemason. And I'm going to show you a link between Sindona's Freemasonry and Ogden, Utah Freemasonry. So I do think that there's a really interesting thing that's developing as I go through this research, which is just sort of this idea of Mormonism being born out of occult behavior in the Smith family, and then it becoming something, though, very, very pragmatic and using occultism to prosper financially, right? Which means you've got to have banksters, right? I call them banksters. I know bankers, right? But I call them banksters because they're like gangsters as far as I'm concerned, right? And they've really just messed up our entire society. So you got to have the banksters. And I think with David M. Kennedy, we found the bankster. So with that, if you guys are ready, I will go ahead and go over to the timeline, and we can just there's a ton to do today. So we can just start going through it if you guys want to.
Yes.
All right.
Everybody's good to go?
So I want to start. Actually, I think I need to refresh this. I think I made a couple changes before the show here. Give me 1 second. Yeah, okay. So I want to start off, and for those who have seen other episodes, or interviews where you guys have had me on, this will look familiar. And I want to talk about really quickly why somebody named LDS Abuse is interested in a banker named David M. Kennedy, because I don't know that that necessarily makes sense unless I sort of talk about it. And so this quote is from a president of the Bank of England, and he says, "The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. Banking was conceived in iniquity and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money and control credit. And with the flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. Take this great power away from the bankers, and all the great fortunes like mine will disappear. And they ought to disappear, for this world would be a better and happier world to live in. But if you wish to remain the slaves of bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them continue to create money and to control credit." And today I just want to really point out this part where he talks about sleight of hand, because I'm on the occult rejects, and one form of occultism is magic, right? And magic is often based on sleight of hand. And I would propose that much of the occultism in the world has to do with this banking system that was set up, right, around the world eventually. And I know a lot of people have done a ton of research on this, so I don't want to try to go too deep into that, because I'm sure there are people who are much smarter than me who have done much more research. But I want to show you how the Mormons fall into this sleight of hand situation in banking inside of the United States of America, because they are key players to this magic trick of the modern banking system, okay? So the reason that this matters to me as a researcher on abuse is because once you get involved in this modern banking system, and your heart turns to loving credit and money and those kinds of things, it leads to outcomes like this. So this is literally from minutes ago. I was on Twitter right before the show, and there's a big Mormon abuse case that is in the news right now. It's about a doctor by the name of David Farley. He was a Mormon church member who was accused of sexually assaulting over 200 women. And CNN covered this story, and when they first covered it, the headline said, "Small town Mormon doctor is accused of sexual abuse." But within, I don't know exactly how long, so like I don't want to twist myself here by saying, but within hours, right, or a day, the headline had been changed, and guess what word they removed out of the headline? It was the word Mormon. Now, what do you think it is that makes a media organization like CNN willing to take down the word Mormon out of their headline when it's just factual that this doctor who's accused of sexually assaulting 200 women, okay, who I just found out we think was assigned to clean the church. Now, the cleaning the church, that's going to sound stupid or sound weird, except if you're a member of the church, what you know is the person assigned to clean the church, there's two very important things about that. One is they get a physical key to the church so they can go there anytime. And two is they often do the work when nobody else is at the church. So why would the Mormon church be giving a man who's accused of sexually assaulting 200 women a physical key to the church where he can have access to that church building at any time when nobody's there? And how can they influence CNN to take the word Mormon out of the headline? Well, to me, it's pretty easy. It's because of the money, right? Because the money leads to power, and the power leads to influence. And so it matters to me as an abuse researcher, because so often people can't distinguish between so I'm going to call, there's really two entities, and this isn't just me saying this. If you go read the Articles of Incorporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is the corporate soul based out of Salt Lake City, they're very clear that there are two entities that have the same name. The name is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Okay, so I separate these things because they separated these things. And The church that I belonged to, which is just a group of people who have a belief in a set of doctrines and those kinds of things, the name of the church was given by revelation, according to people who believe in Mormonism. The name of the corporation was chosen, it was not given by revelation, it was chosen by a bunch of occultists, and I think it was another piece of sleight of hand. Because what it does is it really confuses people when they're talking about Mormonism, because they don't know whether they're talking about the church, right? Let's call it the spiritual body. They don't know if they're talking about the spiritual body, known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or whether they're talking about the corporate soul, which is the multi-billion-dollar corporation that took upon itself the same name as the church that it represents in civil society. Okay? So I personally think that that was a piece of occultism by Skull and Bones prophet Russell M. Nelson and others, right, who have, I mean, occultism has a long history inside of the church. But the fact of the matter is, what we're really talking about is not the church. Like when I come on your show, I am almost never talking about the church. I'm almost always talking about this corporation that took upon itself the name, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that corporation is really nasty. It's just a really nasty bunch of business when you really look into what's going on there. And I'm going to show you some of that nastiness today, okay? To start, we need to start all the way back at a man named David Eccles, okay? Now, David Eccles, I've done fairly extensive research on David at other points, and to me, he seems like he was a pretty good man. He was kind of like, he really lived out the American dream, okay, as we understand it, right? He was very poor. His family emigrated from Scotland. His father had trouble with his eyesight. And David just worked really, really hard at a time when there was a lot of opportunity in this country. And he became like the wealthiest man in Utah and one of the wealthiest men in the United States of America. And one of the really important things to understand for people is that the church, like the LDS leaders, and we've talked about this in other interviews, so I'm going to try to go as fast as I can through this, but had gotten themselves in all kinds of financial trouble. And the person who was constantly bailing them out of the financial trouble that they were in because they just didn't know what they were doing was David Eccles. And so very, very early on in church history, once they come across the plains and over into Utah, the church becomes really beholden to the Eccles family. Because of their lack of financial wherewithal and David Eccles' ability to bail them out when they needed to be bailed out. I haven't really found anything to criticize about David Eccles, except for maybe this, if we're going to be really like finicky about it. So I found a paper that was talking about Eccles, and I'm just going to read this to you guys. It says, two of Eccles's enterprises, beet sugar factories, which should sound familiar to those who've watched my other interviews here, in Ogden and Logan, were founded by him as community projects in keeping with the church leaders' wish to encourage cooperation in founding local industries. Most of his fortune was built, however, through individual entrepreneurial ventures fully in the spirit of his contemporaries, the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. So if people need sort of like context of like where Eccles falls in the financial world, it's his contemporaries are the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, okay? Once again, asked to fulfill a preaching mission for the church. I love it how they put this in this paper. I think it was a BYU professor who wrote this paper. He says, he respectfully declined, arguing that he was of more worth as a provider of jobs than he would be as a missionary. Ecclesiastical leaders recognized the importance of that contribution. David O. McKay, which is a name that we would remember from our episode on Rotary International, David O. McKay is the church president who explicitly stated that the goals of Rotary International are copacetic with the goals of the LDS church, which I would say is not true at this point. I would say that it's probably aligned with the goals of LDS Inc., right? The corporation known as the Church of Jesus Christ. I think David McKay made a misstep when he said that the goals of Rotary International are the same as the goals of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So, but David O. McKay speaking at Eccles' funeral, acknowledged that a man who can produce $1 million and at the same time contribute $1 million to the wealth of the community is a public benefactor. Such a man was David Eccles. Okay, so we're just going to mention David Eccles, and like the only thing that I would criticize here is simply this: if you're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and especially if you're a young man, you are browbeaten from the time you are a little boy until you're 19 years old that you have a duty to serve a proselytizing mission for the church if you can. Okay, but it just so happens if you happen to have $1 million and your name is David Eccles and you decline that, you're going to get a paper written about you where it talks about you respectfully declining that. But if you're Justin Riggs and you choose not to go on a mission, or if you're like a 17-year-old or an 18-year-old Mormon today, and you tell your parents, hey, I don't want to go on a preaching mission because I think I could probably make a little bit more money in Bitcoin, I guarantee you're not going to get a paper written about you saying that you respectfully declined it. You might get thrown out of your house, depending on how strict your parents are, and you'll certainly be looked down upon by the general membership of the church for not serving a mission, because that's what they call a priesthood duty. Okay, so it's a little bit nitpicky, right? And like I said, to me, David Eccles seems to have lived a pretty productive, pretty clean life from everything that I can gather. I don't see anything about Freemasonry in his life or anything like that. He just seems to have worked really hard and gotten extraordinarily wealthy. Well, like a lot of those stories, Dave, let's just talk for 1 second. David Eccles' story is a little bit different than the Rockefellers and the Carnegies in that because Eccles was a Mormon, he was told that he needed to take on a second wife, and he did. And so David Eccles ends up with 2 families in 2 different locations inside of Utah. And that's a long story, but there was a lot of rivalry, and is a lot of rivalry between those 2 families, the first wife and the second wife. And this really plays a huge part in another Eccles that we're going to talk about here coming up really soon, Marriner S. Eccles, okay? But to introduce David Kennedy to the story, let's just note his birth was in 1915. And I have to say, if anybody decides to look into this and they find that any of these dates are wrong, I would love to hear from you, because there are a lot of sources about Kennedy, but the chronology is surprisingly, there's a lot of contradictions in different sources. So I'm pretty sure that he was born in 1915, July 21st, but I did find other things that indicated that maybe he wasn't. So if anybody wants to correct me, please feel free. So the Eccles came out of Scotland, as did the Kennedys. And we can see that here in that David Kennedy served his LDS mission in 1926 in England and Scotland. And here we have a picture of Mr. Kennedy in his family tartan, I guess is how you say that, I'm not really sure, during his mission in Great Britain. And just for those who are watching, if you might be Mormon, Kennedy's mission was a little bit interesting because he actually got married first, and then they sent him on a mission. And so it wasn't that unusual in Joseph Smith's time, but I think this is sort of the end of that kind of practice. But Kennedy gets married, he goes to serve a mission in Great Britain, and he has 2 of the most famous Mormons as his mission presidents. One is James Talmage, and the other is John A. Whitsoe, who we talked about. John Whitsoe, we talked about, had overheard about the conspiracy to overthrow the University of Utah and the state of Utah and wrote a book about it later on. So that's who David Kennedy served under while he was on a mission in England. So after his mission, Kennedy moves straight to Washington, D.C. And again, people can go back and they can see how we've talked about how after Reed Smoot gets pulled over to Washington, D.C. as a senator, there's a cadre of Mormons that move themselves out to the swamp and really entrench themselves in the halls of power of the United States. And Kennedy is going to be one of these. Now, it's a little bit difficult to find, at least for me so far, it's been a little bit difficult to find a lot of information about David M. Kennedy's early life and his family situation. But what we do know is that some of his family owned banks in Randolph, Utah. And so that helps me understand a little bit better why Kennedy ended up going into banking. But
Can you
I'm just
repeat
not
that
really
one
sure.
last sentence? Because you said something and it turned into like a robot sound.
Oh, did it go to the robot?
Yeah.
So I guess, I don't know if I remember exactly what it is. What I was saying is that there's not a lot of information about Kennedy's early childhood, except that we know that some of his family owned banks in Randolph, Utah.
Okay.
And so it helps me understand a little bit better how Kennedy got into banking, because you have to understand Randolph, Utah is like not even a dot on the map, really. And so for Kennedy to have the life that he did is a little bit confusing, and there's not a ton of information about his early life. What we do know is that he graduated from a little college called Weber College. So he's not a University of Utah guy. He's not an occult secret society guy, as far as I can tell up to this point. But he goes straight from this little college, Weber College, and moves to Washington, D.C., where he earns a couple degrees at George Washington University, and then completes a graduate degree at this school called I think it's called Stonier. I don't know how to say that. Stonier. Stonier Graduate School of Banking at Rutgers. And I was not able to identify how it was he was able to gain access to these schools and why they chose to allow him to come there or anything like that. But it could be that he was just really smart. What we do know is that he was very much being watched and worked with the Eccles family. So David Eccles' most famous son is probably Marriner S. Eccles. And we talked a little bit about Marriner in other interviews, but I'm going to talk a little bit more extensively about this, because the thing to understand is that David M. Kennedy worked with and corresponded with Eccles a lot. And so I think it's fair to say that he was an acolyte of Eccles and Eccles' worldview. And again, I might be wrong about this, because like I haven't spent years and years, I don't have a PhD in this. And so if somebody wants to come along and correct me, that's fine. But what you can see is if you go to
they will correct you.
Eccles' page. Yeah, right.
You should know this by now,
on
too,
the Federal
bro.
Reserve page. Yeah, well, look, and I welcome it, right? Like,
I understand.
I think a lot of people get a lot of joy in pointing out where I'm wrong, but the fact is, I know that I'm wrong a lot. I'm not trying to say that I'm right about anything. I'm just trying to throw some things out that are historical. So I actually like it when people correct me, because I can just update it in my presentation and we can move on with our lives, right? So yeah, I mean, like, look, I wish I was rich and I could give a bounty for every time I'm wrong, and people could make a little bit of money off of it. But unfortunately, I'm not a bankster, and so I'm dead poor, and I can't offer that. But I welcome corrections. I love it. So what you can see is that I don't know if you guys can see this on your screens, but all of these are memorandums to Chairman Eccles written by David Kennedy. And this is just a small. I mean, I had to do a screenshot, right? But Kennedy and Eccles are really attached at the hip, okay? And so we didn't really talk about Eccles and his philosophy very much in our other interview, so I want to take just a little bit of time setting this up to help you understand why it's important that Kennedy and Eccles are sort of tied at the hip. So a couple things about Marriner S. Eccles. He was not an educated man. He dropped out of school when he was either 17 or 18, something like that. But he was the person who really took over David Eccles' fortune, and was the person who took that and turned it into, he took all the money that his father had made in what I would call productive industries, and he then rolled it into the banking industry, okay? And so he became probably the most prominent Utahn of his generation, I would say. And there's a book that everybody can go read if they want to, written by Marriner Eccles, called Beckoning Frontiers. It's his autobiography. And he talks about how he had rolled all of his father's wealth into the banking industry. And in around 1930, I'm actually going to go down here first, and then I'll come back up to this other one. So around 1930, of course, is the Great Depression. And so I found this paper that explains what was going on with Marriner Eccles around 1930. It says the next decade would tell a different story. By 1930, the nation was in the grip of the Great Depression, and Eccles stood to lose much of what he had worked for during the previous 18 years. As he reflected on the dynamics of the national economy and the responsibilities of business and government towards society, He decided that hard work and thrift as a means of pulling us out of the depression is unsound economically. True hard work means more production, but thrift and economy means less consumption. Okay, I'm not going to read the rest of this, but I'm going to come back. If everybody looks down here, maybe I can show you. You can see that one group that was particularly interested in Eccles' ideas was a group of Ogden businessmen called, I have no idea, this is German, it's what, Freidankers? I don't know how you say it. German for freethinker. They're also known phonetically as the free drinkers. So I think it's important, though, that the people that were really interested in encouraging Marriner Eccles was a group of Germans who had set up shop in Ogden. And I am not at all able to find out who was in this group. I've tried, I've looked, and I haven't been able to find out who it is. But I would be very, very interested to know the occult affiliations with this group of people, potentially, right? But for right now, let's just point out that Eccles was in danger of losing his father's fortune after rolling it all into what I would call unproductive industries like banking, which are really based on sleight of hand. And because of the Great Depression, he was going to lose all of that, or in danger of losing all of that. And so because of his power and influence in the state, he was able to really sway fiscal policy, not just in Utah, but in the entire United States of America. And it was really based on this idea of hard work and thrift not being the answer, and also that the ends of production is consumption. And I don't want to get too far off onto this, but it's hard to explain how anti-Mormon those positions are, right? And so, like, Mormonism in its standard works and in its scriptures is really based on this idea of industry and thrift leading to prosperity, which leads to pride, which leads to doing things like banking, really. Like, and that's a very loose interpretation of like the Book of Mormon, but like it's those types of activities that are non-productive and not based on thrift and industry. And so I think it's really important to understand that Marriner Eccles, had a break with the Mormon Church, and his philosophies go from aligning with his father's philosophies, which I would say are much more Mormon in their bent. And when he was going to lose his fortune, all of a sudden he breaks from the church, and his philosophies kind of go 180 from what you would consider traditional Mormon beliefs about industry, thrift, and production and consumption. Okay.
Justin, I will.
Here's the quote about Marriner. Yeah.
No, just I know a few Mormons, and they were always very prosperous and prolific as economically as individuals. And I always admired that, because I was like, wow, I wonder if that's part of their tenets, in that they're always so economically savvy. And I mean, really savvy. Yeah. And so it seemed something to stick out as well. And then the other comment that I wanted to make is that when you're talking about how most of these are, in the banking and economics or whatever, we're familiar with a managerial class as well that has kind of taken over some of the banking systems here in the US and throughout the world. And so when we talk about how they kind of have an affiliation, or maybe their tenets kind of parallel each other, it's almost like if they're, reading the same script. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah. No, not at all. I think it's such a great point. I mean, so like, and again, like, I mean, we're not here to like preach Mormonism, but like the Book of Mormon is really founded on this, what they call the pride cycle. And it really starts with like the love of money leading to the destruction of civilizations, because the love of money usually ends up with secret societies being formed that then have their secret handshakes, and they have their secret words, and they promise to protect each other so that they can continue to have wealth, power, and influence, right? So on a very core level, like the Eccles family story is a very like biblical / Book of Mormonish story. And what you see is the divorce of Marriner Eccles from what he calls his father's simple faith, right? You can see right here in this quote, Eccles, this is Marriner Eccles. Marriner Eccles himself maintained that the career of his father, pioneer industrialist David Eccles, had, quote, governed my own conduct from the time of his death in 1912 to a memorable day in 1930, end quote. At that time, distressed by the Depression, of course, he's distressed because he's going to lose all of his wealth, power, and influence, right? The younger Eccles, quote, became disenchanted of, and then the brackets are inserted by the author, his father's simple faith, beginning, as he put it, quote, my search for a body of ideas and practices more suited to an economy that had outgrown the frontier. The double meaning in this phrase is obvious. It seems likely that Eccles' estrangement from the Mormon Church had caused him to underestimate the influence upon his own thought of his provincial Mormon background. So I think the thing that's really important for anybody who's a member of the church or anybody who lives in Utah is that there was really like a true, it was like a sort of a philosophical civil war that happened in Marriner Eccles' own brain. And the problem for the church is they were already so wrapped in with the Eccles family because of David Eccles' support of the church that when Marriner Eccles apostatizes and develops these new philosophies, the church doesn't really have much choice but to go along with Marriner Eccles because they continue to need him to bail them out financially. And he just has so much power and influence at that point that how do you divorce from that, right? Okay, so that's pretty, I think that's just the background that I want to give on Eccles, is that he really divorces himself from the church. He divorces himself from church principles, and this uneducated but very wealthy and influential man starts looking for financial ideas outside of his backwards upbringing, I guess, right? If you want to put it that way, or his father's simple faith is maybe a better way of saying that. So where that kind of leads to is that if you have Eccles mentoring Kennedy ends up being a part of one of the largest banks, not just a part of, he ends up running one of the largest banks in the United States of America. It was like either the 6th or the 9th largest bank, and that's Continental, Illinois. And I think I said it on Twitter this week. You know, when I was doing my interviews with you guys at first, and you were bringing up like Nazi connections, it's stuff that I'd heard about, but I also didn't really know like how to quite like handle that or address it, because although I knew that the Nazis had like shown favor towards the Mormons during World War II, and I'd read the book about that, like I'd never really had an understanding of why that might be. Well, I think we may have found that connection. And that connection is through David M. Kennedy and Continental, Illinois. So if you were to go to the CIA reading room and type in Continental, Illinois, there would be 2 results, but it's actually the same document twice. And so I only screenshot the first thing. And if you look over here on the right side of my screen, that document is contained in the CIA reading room in what collection? In the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act collection.
Oh. Huh.
Okay.
Damn.
Okay.
And the document is called Nazi Escape Routes to where? Argentina, which we've talked a lot about in other interviews, haven't we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think this is the document that sort of gets us on the right page or on the right path of connecting Mormons through David Kennedy in Continental, Illinois, which is through David Eccles, or not David Eccles, excuse me, Marriner Eccles, right? And I think we can begin to start to see a picture forming, right? Like a lot of my stuff frustrates people because it's me just sort of like, here's a document and here's a document and here's a document. And people are like, well, what's your conclusion? And I'm like, well, I don't know. Like, I hate to form conclusions because once I form a conclusion, I can be wrong. It's much more fun just to throw out a piece of evidence here and a piece of evidence here and then let people form their own conclusions, right? But certainly for me, seeing this document helps me place a piece of the puzzle that helps me start forming tentative conclusions about what's going on here. Because you can't divorce David Kennedy from Continental, Illinois, and you can't divorce Continental, Illinois from the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act because it's documented, okay? I think I'm just going to skip this next one. This idea of bondage for everyone. I mean, it may just be more based on my lack of understanding of the financial sector. You have to understand that, like, I love researching, but anytime I get to anything that's real estate related or financial related, my eyes kind of glaze over and roll on the back of my head because I just don't care about that stuff. But the idea here is simply this. Before David Kennedy showed up at Continental, Illinois, they were they were really known, and we'll see a quote that'll explain this better, but they were really known as sort of they like to play it safe. A lot of their stuff was in securities. When David Kennedy gets there, he goes into bonds, and he really wants to internationalize the bank, and everything becomes much more credit-based and risky, okay, that's Eccles, right? And so, and I just I love words, right? And so this idea of David Kennedy taking a bank that was focused on securities and then turning it into a bank that was all about bonds, those are really interesting words to me. And a lot of banking words are really interesting to me, right? All I know is that I don't want to be in bondage. And so I know that people think bonds are the most safe investment, blah, blah, blah. Again, I don't care. So this may be just me and my strange brain drawing conclusions or drawing links where they're not, but it's certainly a matter of historical fact that before David Kennedy's at Continental, Illinois, they're a much more conservative bank. And after David Kennedy came, they were very well, you'll see there, it actually becomes Continental Illinois is the bank where the term too big to fail got coined. And I'll show you that later on. So we see that Continental Illinois and David Kennedy are tied to the Nazi Disclosure Act. And here's where that really pulls in, okay? I call this careful who you play with, because again, one of the things that it's hard to get across to people is the hypocrisy of the Mormon aristocracy versus what you're taught as a member of the church. And since there aren't a lot of members of the church, even though they want to pretend that there are, right? They want to say that there's 14 or 16 million or whatever it is, but that number of people who actually go to church on a regular basis is maybe a quarter of that, right? I would say, I don't know, nobody can really know because they refuse to share the numbers, don't they? So we all have to guess and look like idiots, and then they point at us and say, you don't know. And I said, well, that's true because you won't tell us. So, but I guarantee you it's not 14 or 16 million people. But growing up in the church, you're constantly bombarded with lessons of being careful who you affiliate with, being careful who you spend your time with. And if you take even one step off the path, how it's going to lead you into all these, terrible outcomes. But then when you look at the actual history of the Mormon aristocracy, here are the people that they're playing with, okay? So I'm just going to read this. And I think I may have read this in our last interview too, but I think it's important to read it again for those who haven't had the chance to see that last interview. This says, much of what is known about the sect, comes from John Roche, a professor at Oxford University who left the order, meaning Opus Dei, and broke his pledge of secrecy. In an essay titled The Inner World of Opus Dei, Roche writes, internally it is totalitarian and imbued with fascist ideas turned to religious purposes, ideas which were surely drawn from the Spain of its early years. Okay, Spain is important because the bank that ties Kennedy to Opus Dei is in Barcelona, which we're going to see at the end of this quote. It says, it is virtually a cult in spirit, a law unto itself, totally self-centered, grudgingly accepting Roman authority because it still considers Rome orthodox. By 1984, when the reparation was made, Opus Dei had become a $3 billion enterprise, controlling 600 newspapers, 52 radio and television stations, 12 film companies, and 38 news agencies. Prominent Americans who became affiliated with the movement included CIA Director William Casey, William Simon of Citicorp, Francis X Stanford, my fault, of Chase Manhattan, and Sergeant Shriver, a former Democratic candidate for vice president. And then it has this sort of footnote of David Kennedy of Continental Illinois, albeit a Mormon, became a conspicuous friend of the sect since his bank was a leading shareholder of an Opus Dei bank in Barcelona. Okay. And here's what I've learned in the last couple of weeks since we talked. I really think that David M. Kennedy is the person who set up a very Opus Dei-like organization inside of the Mormon Church. And I know, Lisa, we were talking about this a little bit before the show, and you mentioned that maybe this was the Vatican's chance to infiltrate the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I think that's a fine hypothesis for somebody to look at and do the research to see if the documentation bears that out. But what it really looks like to me as we go through this is that the Mormon Church ends up having a very Opus Dei-like organization inside the church. And I know a lot of Mormons, if they're watching, will be like, well, they already had this in the Danites, right? But I think this is really different. The Danites were really just muscle, okay? Opus Dei it's brains and muscle, right? Through the Knights of Malta and all these kind of organizations. And I think that maybe Mormonism had the muscle in the Danites, but I think Kennedy and his generation are the ones that were able to set up an organization inside the organization that's very Opus Dei-like, right? Which right now I'm just calling LDS Inc., but I don't know, maybe we can call it Opus Dopes, because I think they're a bunch of dopes for doing this, but that's just me. Really, honestly, it's really upsetting as somebody who devoted 45 years of my life to this church, to see them setting this up, this secret organization inside the corporation, and then using my family and my loved ones as beer for their illegal, immoral, and unethical activities. So anyway, sorry for that little outburst. A little bit of trauma vomit there for everybody.
Justin, if I may interject just real quick, just for the people that don't know, Opus Dei was started in Spain, and that's where you get the connection with Spain and the Vatican and all that other stuff. Just FYI, just wanted to insert that.
Yeah, something I wanted to mention too about them is that I do think there's probably connections to Jesuits. I mean, and there is a Jesuit that is involved in Opus Dei.
Yeah.
What else?
We're going to see that like explicitly. I have something on here that will show that that David Kennedy's closest friend over there in all of this was trained in a Jesuit school. So you're absolutely right.
And if you even look at some of the weird stuff about Opus Dei, it almost parallels Scientology a little bit. It gets a little weird too.
Yes. And like Teresa brilliantly said in the chat, they're very mafia-esque. Very.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. And so, growing up, I always heard about the Mormon Mafia, right? And in fact, we would like walk around school, and me and my buddies, we would all pretend like, yeah, we're the Mormon, right? Like, but I think it's actually probably a lot more literal than I understood as a kid, right? Because I don't want to get, too far off on this, but like, the Mormon Mafia really centers around Las Vegas, right? And it really centers around Howard Hughes, and it really centers around I can't remember his name right now, but it was actually Howard Hughes's like sort of arch nemesis out there in Las Vegas. And I'll talk a little bit more about it, but like I think that what we've stumbled upon here with David M. Kennedy is sort of the godfather, right, of Mormon Opus Dei, which is very, very much very mob-like, right? And maybe not the Genesis and maybe not the Godfather, I don't know, but definitely a major player inside of this that connects the Mormon Church to the Vatican Church in ways that it never had been before through banking, right? So let's look at this here. So there are two really important stories about this, and they come from Mother Jones, and one of them is called Banking God, the Mob, and CIA. And I would encourage everybody to go and read this. The other one, it's There Will Be Done is what it's called, the story. And you can just Google those, and I would encourage everybody to go read that. It's very light on the Mormon side of things, but it's very heavy on sort of the Opus Dei, Knights of Malta, CIA connections, which I know that there's probably a lot more people who are interested in that than they are in Mormon's sort of small connection into here, or maybe not small, but in the grand scheme of things, I think, they're a smaller part of it. So here's a quote from that article. It says, often the CIA and a government like the Vatican will interact in major ways through one person. Such is the case with, and I don't even want to try to say this because I don't know, it's Michele, but it's Italian. Is that Michael or is it Michelle? How do they pronounce that? Anyway, we're just going to use the last name. It's Sindona, okay? Sindona rose from peasant roots in Sicily to become one of the most influential bankers in the Western world. At the height of his power, Sindona lorded over a financial empire that stretched from Rome to Hollywood and included half the largest banks in Switzerland. He controlled hundreds of corporations and counted among his partners such influential allies as David Kennedy, Treasury Secretary under Richard Nixon, and Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. I don't know how to pronounce that, president of the Vatican Bank. And then there's a little side note about Marcinkus dodging Italian police, which will become part of our story later on. The thing I want to point out is that the people looking at this were really honed in on the Catholic Church's involvement. But everything that they say about Sindona could be said about Kennedy. Kennedy rose from very humble roots in Randolph, Utah, to become one of the most influential bankers in the United States of America and really in the Western world, right? I mean, he's the Treasury Secretary in the cabinet of Nixon, okay? So at the height of his power, Kennedy lorded over a financial empire, right? Or at least was a part of a financial empire in LDS Inc. that stretched from Rome to Hollywood. And I don't have the information yet about this, but I have been contacted, and it's not private, so I don't really mind. Anybody can go and find this on my Twitter, but there's a man on Twitter that has been sort of feeding me information who has done a lot of work for the Department of Defense, and he is adamant that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church, was deeply involved in all of this CIA stuff, and it was through banks in Switzerland. And so we're going to talk about another individual who's tied into this that really surprised me as we go through this presentation, and it's actually coming up in our next little piece here. But the fact that this article points out Switzerland, which matches the intel that I've been given through this guy who's done a lot of work in higher levels of the government, telling me that Mormons have an entire financial transaction history that it's based out of what he calls like the Mormon. I can't remember what he calls it. It's not a Mormon word, so I always laugh when I read it. But anyway, the group of Mormons in Switzerland, okay? And he swears that that's where this all was funneled through and laundered through, which makes a lot of sense because, as we all know, Switzerland is very well known for having banks where you can do those kinds of transactions, right?
You know, something I find interesting with Switzerland, though, is like how that does go back, I mean, in my opinion, with MK Ultra and acid.
Okay.
You know, and like the weird, and I guess the other weird thing why I'm bringing this up is because we're doing a show this week on Occult, and that has ties back to Switzerland, back to LSD studies and Gladio, and you mentioned Gladio before as well. So it just seems very weird how like. I mean, again, I guess if we bought all that LSD from Switzerland, I mean, that had to go to a bank as well, correct? Like,
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. You
I don't know.
You
It's just you're starting to wonder what's going on over here, man.
Yeah. And so I'll be interested. I mean, I'll be interested to see if we ever see those financial transactions in black and white that establish what I'm being told. But I mean, certainly all of the corroborating evidence points to this intelligence being accurate that I'm receiving on Twitter, right? So, I took a little bit of time and I looked at, what is it about Switzerland and Mormons? And it was really surprising to see this name, Percy K. Fetzer, which I've highlighted down here, pop out. And I'm going to tell you why after I read this quote. But let's just read this quote that is in an article that's published by the church, okay? Switzerland was an ideal place for the church's first international temple. Okay, so I think that's interesting, first and foremost, that the first place that they put a temple outside of the United States is in Switzerland because of its geographic location and diversity of languages. Because Switzerland is connected to most European countries by rail, we've talked a lot about railroads, right? It was convenient for saints in neighboring countries to travel there. Hawkins wrote, most Swiss natives, including temple workers, speak multiple languages, including Swiss, German, French, Italian, or Romansh, I don't know how to say that, making it possible for members from all parts of Europe to participate in temple ordinances. Because of this representation of people of so many languages and I think I'm supposed to say ethnic backgrounds at the temple, Bern Temple President Percy K. Fetzer referred to the sacred edifice as the United Nations of Europe. That is a pretty startling quote from a pretty interesting person that almost nobody in the church knows about. And I'm only beginning my research on Percy K. Fetzer, but here's what I can tell you. Percy K. Fetzer has direct ties to Germany, okay, from earlier on. Then he ends up in Switzerland, and eventually he ends up in Salt Lake City, serving in a stake presidency with a convicted, I don't know if it's a felony, actually. He may have pled down. Anyway, with a man by the name of John Burt, who was working in Salt Lake City in the recorder's office and was caught falsifying records. And unfortunately for the world, probably because of his connections with Fetzer and all these other people, he was able to plea down And part of the plea was that nobody knows what records he was falsifying. But we do know that John Burt was falsifying records and was in a stake presidency. So it's another criminal serving in a stake presidency in the Mormon Church, of which there are an alarming number of these people that you just don't know about. The other person that Percy K. Fetzer was in a stake presidency with was Thomas S. Monson. And for anybody who knows anything about the church, they'll know that Thomas S. Monson ended up being president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the prophet. Okay? So to see Fetzer in Switzerland as the temple president in Bern was really eye-opening, because all these reasons that they give in this article are plausible. But let me just ask you, if you were LDS Inc. and you needed a hub to run your laundering operations out of, but you needed a religious cover to do that, the easiest thing to do would be to build a temple there. And all the reasons that they give for putting the temple there are good, not just for the reasons that they say, but they're also good because it's an international financial center where it's easy to launder money, isn't it? So the fact that the Mormons chose Switzerland as the first place to put an international temple, and their temple president, who we know affiliates with criminals, and then just, for me, Thomas S. Monson ignored abuse perpetrated by his best friend, O. Preston Robinson, who was the head of Deseret News for a while. So like I have a thing with Thomas S. Monson because he knew about abuse and he just refused to do anything about it. But the fact that this is where they set up their first temple and that it's Percy Fetzer sets off huge alarm bells in my mind. And we're going to see Fetzer a couple more times here before the end of the presentation. But let's keep rolling because we've got a lot to cover and we're already, I think, like about an hour into it. So a couple other things just to understand about Kennedy is he's one of these guys who has his finger in everything. So from 1957 to 1966, you can see Kennedy serving as the chairman of Mayor Richard J. Daley's Mayor's Committee for Economic and Cultural Growth in Chicago. As we all know, the Daleys, right, major crime family, you know, whatever. And so Kennedy's serving as the chairman for Richard Daley for his Committee for Economic and Cultural Growth. He's also a member of the Board of Trustees of the University of Chicago. Okay, the next prophet of the church, Dallin Oaks, and many, many, many prominent Mormons are University of Chicago guys, right? Pretty easy to single out who's part of the mob right here, if you want to, you know, the mafia group here inside of Mormonism, because a lot of them go up to that area of Michigan and then also into Chicago at the University of Chicago. While serving in this post, he was involved in fundraising. And then here's where we sort of first see Kennedy involved with Mormonism again. In 1966, he was asked to head a fundraising drive for Brigham Young University. He worked on this project until he became the U.S. Treasury Secretary. From 1961 until 1969, Kennedy was a member of the Board of Trustees of the Brookings Institution. Okay, so Brookings Institution is a very well-known think tank.
Yes.
Yes. And, you know, ties in with like the sort of the Kissinger, you know, faction and all that. And we'll see like that certainly Kennedy and Kissinger are well acquainted with each other and worked a lot with one another.
And
we'll see that coming up here pretty soon.
And the Brookings Institute is the most highly cited source for both political parties in the U.S. Yeah.
Yep. And so David M. Kennedy, very powerful, very influential man who sat on the board of that institution. Okay. So Nick, you mentioned Switzerland and LSD, which I know nothing about, but just surprise, surprise, what you can see is that, you know, when that LSD comes across, what I do know is that a lot of it ends up over in Palo Alto and in California, right? And because they're doing the mind control, the MK Ultra experiments, and you have a very, very prominent Mormon connection and pipeline out of Stanford for generations now. Let's see if I can get that to stay. There we go. So here, for example, and this person may even still be alive for all I know, and so I feel kind of bad. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. Sorry, give me 1 second, guys. Let me get my things reset. There we go. Sorry about that. If we don't do it right, it makes things really wonky. But here's a man by the name of David Peterson, and just did it again. All apologies, everybody. Here, we're going to fix it in just a second. See if I can just get my head on straight. There we go.
Very nice.
So this is a man by the name of David Peterson. Okay, and David Peterson, you can ignore David Peterson for all I know, but I just want to show you sort of the type of person that's coming out of the Stanford pipeline, and I want to point out some other names. So this is a testimony that David Peterson gives at the request of Daniel Peterson, because Mormon scholars love to think that their testimonies are more important than the testimonies of plebs like myself. And so they have a whole website of Mormon scholars testifying, because apparently if a scholar believes that Mormonism is true, it counts more than if a farmer believes that it's true. So here's what he says, though. A little background. I was born in San Francisco, California, and grew up in the shadow of Stanford University, where Elder David B. Haight was my stake president and a family friend. I don't know if we've talked about David Haight, but David Haight is an occult secret society member who has deep involvement in multiple abuse cases that I can't really talk about right now, because it's not really well known, his involvement in those cases, but deep, deep involvement in LDS abuse cases, okay? Who also happened to be the mayor of Palo Alto, California, where Stanford is, right? David Peterson goes on to say, I received my BA degree from Occidental College in Los Angeles after serving in the North German mission with President Percy K. Fetzer, and as European Mission Secretary to Elder Alvin R. Dyer and Elder Theodore M. Burton. Graduate studies followed. He becomes a lawyer, blah, 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 blah. He goes to Harvard. You know, he says he's been admitted to practice before the United States Supreme Court. He goes through all his credentials. And then here's something really interesting. He says, interestingly, as I departed following the completion of that work, I was presented with a 1929 photograph showing the entire State Department staff in front of the old executive office building on Pennsylvania Avenue, with Undersecretary of State J. Reuben Clark front and center next to Secretary of State Kellogg. So J. Reuben Clark I think he was actually in some of the first presidencies of the church. And I did not know that J. Reuben Clark was Undersecretary of State at the same time that David M. Kennedy was Treasury Secretary, okay? Or right around, like a couple decades before, right? But this rotating group of Stanford and Washington, D.C. and Chicago Mormon aristocrats, right? And their offspring, the pattern, like it's not even a pattern. It's just an established historical fact. It's just an established historical fact that nobody's really researched and looked into too closely, right? But you're always going to find really prominent Mormons like J. Reuben Clark and David M. Kennedy in some of the highest levels of government inside the United States government. Okay, and where are they coming out of? They're coming out of Palo Alto, California, where Occult Secret Society member David B. Haight was the mayor there for a very, very long time. And other families like Garrett Gong's family, I think, have really deep Stanford ties, Palo Alto ties.
Oh, real quick, Justin, if you don't mind me, stop.
Not at all, please.
Just something I want to bring up, and it's something that me and Lisa, I think, have heard repeatedly recently with guests and just certain topics on the show. The other shows, maybe didn't want to screw up the flow of the way the show was going and really didn't get into it. But I know I can with you. Stanford, you just mentioned Stanford University again. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of stuff that has even popped up that are associated with Stanford University. I think it was even Jim Morrison in another topic. And now this, but there's been tons of stuff that me and Lisa have looked at, really with Stanford University, that again, that's kind of in my opinion, you're going back to another place that is associated with using drugs to alter people's minds and almost growing cult-like followings or thinking.
Yes.
And it's again, we see it again now with this. It's just very weird.
Yeah, so let's just take a second and let's just I know I like to do the conspiracy theory kind of stuff every once in a while, inside of our shows and stuff like that. So this is something that I haven't been able to substantiate very well with documents, but let me sort of tell you the whispers I'm hearing as I talk to people, including people who lived out there and grew up out there. So the Mormon population out at Stanford happens to be the gifted and talented population. Okay. So I'm hearing from people who grew up in Palo Alto and lived in Stanford and were placed into gifted and talented programs out in that area, and then are claiming that they and their families were a part of these MK Ultra programs. The other thing that I'm hearing, which again, not substantiated by documentation, but I don't know that I would expect it to be substantiated by documentation if it's true because it's so explosive, is that the Mormons who end up out in Palo Alto, California, are really a big part of the eugenics experimentation of the government. And if you look at a Mormon, your average Mormon, you would know why, especially your average Mormon coming out of Utah and going to Palo Alto, right? So Roddy Jules knows way more about this, but we did sort of talk about it for a while back in the day. And there's a guy by the name, I believe, of Louis Terman, if I'm remembering right. And he's studying the gifted and talented children at Stanford. It's like the seminal study on gifted and talented. And it ends up that one of the people that's working for Terman ends up going to where? The University of Utah. And she spends her entire career at the University of Utah in this sort of field of gifted and talented, right? And so we also know that, I want to be really careful with my words here. In the LDS abuse research space, there are hubs. Let's use the word hubs. There are hubs that we have sort of identified as hotspots for large amounts of abuse inside of Mormon populations. And Palo Alto, California is certainly one of those hubs, okay? As is Chicago, as is Washington, D.C., obviously the I-15 corridor, as is like Tampa, Florida. And so like, I guess what I'm saying, Nick, is like, I think your intuition there is dead on. And I don't know if they were using drugs to influence the Mormon kids or not. I know that I've heard that they were using drugs to influence the Mormon kids, but I certainly think that for whatever reason, there is a large population of very bright, very white Mormon families who end up in Palo Alto, California, right around the time that they're doing all these mind control experiments. And so probably something that people should look into a little bit more and see if those kinds of things can be established a little bit firmer in the historical record through documentation. And then also through, I think personally that those who went through this, unfortunately, when they step forward, they get ridiculed, right? Mm-hmm. And they're considered fringe and they get pushed off to the side. And I would just say that if there's anybody who is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who believes that they were a part of these programs, we may or may not be able to establish it, with documents, but your voice really matters. And if you've been pushed aside and called a conspiracy theorist or told that you're fringe or called crazy or whatever, I hope you know that you can reach out to me and I'd be happy to listen to your story because I think that your story is just as important as any document that I could ever find. And I'd be happy to document your story for you so that moving forward, there's a document for generations that come behind us. Because I think there were some things going on there that we're not likely going to find the documents for it, because if those documents exist, they're probably destroyed, right? Mm-hmm. So the only thing we have left is the people who went through it. So I'd be happy to document those stories for people.
I would also insert that there's always a paper trail if you know where to look. And if you wanted to look at these experimentations specifically with LDS or just in general because they didn't just do LSD. I'm sorry, LSD, not LDS, sorry. Right. If you wanted to look at these mind-altering type experimentations, consciousness mainly, and I think that's kind of what they were trying to do, is look at consciousness and how to tap into it, achieve it, alter it, what have you, right?
Sure.
One good thing about scientists is they love to boast, right? And so they're going to publish their stuff because they want to kind of tout their collar that I was able to do this and probably be the first or what have you. And so when you look at Palo Alto, it wasn't just Stanford. It was also UCLA. If anything, UCLA pioneered most of the LSD studies. And then it moved over to Yale and Harvard, and then bounced back to Stanford. And then this is where you start to get these think tanks being created. So one of them in particular, Esalen Institute and so forth, which has now taken on the role of pushing psychedelics. But one main thing is that you look at Palo Alto and you're like, what else came out of Palo Alto? Well, it was a lot of government was moving there after the Cold War. And also, if you look at Cold War propaganda, right up the street was Lookout Mountain Air Force Base. So you have a high concentration of military families, and military families are highly educated as well as pretty smart. And so what to do with their children while they're attending school in some of these government facilities is anyone's guess. And you see a lot of government children kind of being propped up in the entertainment industry, or some of the scientists, type gifted and talented sectors as well. One of the other things that I kind of wanted to say is Palo Alto is also well known for their Silicon Valley exports, right? And so if you kind of look back, Boston kind of was the forerunner of the first, quote unquote, underground Silicon Valley, and then it moved to Palo Alto, and then it's kind of been dispersed throughout. So you're kind of having a high concentration, like you said, of these white, affluent, educated families. And why not tap into their children who are just down the road at the elementary, junior high, high school? You know what I mean? And so if you're trying to look at stuff like that, what you can do is look at the timeline, the time frame when these experiments were happening, and then look into the scientific literature. Who was publishing where? And if they were publishing in that area, these types of consciousness type altering, LSD type experiments in Palo Alto, you can probably guess that this is what was happening in that area.
Yeah, wow. I mean, just really I wish you could see inside my brain right now, because it's just so brilliant. And here's the thing, all those things and all those places that you mentioned, I could give you a Mormon name right now, right? I mean, because of course you've got Romney up in Boston with Bain Capital, and who's working with him? It's the Gay family, which is the Mormon mafia. And they have to shut down Bain Capital because Gay's daughter is off on a drug binge, right? Why is she on a drug binge? Was it because she had been experimented on as a kid and was unable to get her life together? You see this so much in Mormon aristocrats' families, that their children are just off the charts wild, right? Well, why? If they're growing up in these stable, secure families where they're living their religion, why are they all, bouncing off the walls all the time? Well, if they're at Stanford as a child, or in Boston as a child, or at the University of Chicago or Columbia University as a child being experimented on, it might explain some of that behavior, right? Potentially. Right. So anyway, everything you said, I could literally give you a name. You talk about the scientific institutes. We could talk about the Eyring Institute, right? Henry B. Eyring is a member of the first presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. His dad was one of the most famous scientists of his time, right? Out of Princeton, right? So yeah, I think, look, if you're a young, enterprising college student who wants to do a PhD and do something amazing for the world and add to the literature, I'm just a local yokel from Tennessee, looking on Google. If somebody had the time and energy and wanted to put the effort into doing this, I think it would be an incredible dissertation, right?
Absolutely.
To talk about this. So I hope there's somebody out there at some point. I'm old and decrepit. I'm not going to be doing a PhD, right? So but I hope there's some young person who comes across this and decides that there's enough smoke here to devote a few years of their life. I think they would be amazed at what they find. I really do believe that with all my heart.
Yeah.
All right, so let's keep rolling. You talked about government. So one of the things that David M. Kennedy was appointed to was a member of a private corporation, known as ComSat, which owned and operated the United States share of a global satellite communication system. Okay. I mean, does David M. Kennedy know anything about satellites or communication systems? I don't really think so, but He's certainly a part of this Opus Dei network, right? He's certainly a part of the Vatican network. He's certainly a part of the Gangsters network. And so you got to get him on this new technology of satellites, global satellite communication systems, right? And sure enough, John F. Kennedy appointed him to be a member of that private corporation. This next one is, it's got to be one of the weirdest things that I have ever come across in my research. So this is from Time magazine, right? Which we know is an organ of the Central Intelligence Agency, right?
I think so, yeah.
And they write this about David Kennedy on January 3rd, 1964. In a section called Personalities. It says, Chicago's Continental Illinois National Bank, the Midwest's biggest bank, assets of $4 billion, was once known as the sleeping giant of LaSalle Street because it conservatively plowed its rich deposits into low-yield securities. Today, advertising itself as the big bank with the little bank inside, Continental is wide awake to the potential of retail banking. Oh, sorry. I just didn't do my punctuation here. Let's do this one more time. Today, advertising itself as the big bank with the little bank inside, Continental is wide awake to the potential of retail banking, allots 60% of its funds for loans, and stresses quote unquote family banking. Now, and then they say, Continental's Benzedrine was administered by Chairman David M. Kennedy, 58, who came to the bank as a bond officer in 1946. And when I saw this, I just didn't even know, like, I knew that Benzedrine had to be some kind of a medication, right? But I was a Mormon. I don't know drugs. I don't know what you're talking about. But Benzedrine is an amphetamine, okay? And I actually took the time to look at the usage of this word across time. And I can tell you that this is not a word that people were using in Time magazine or any other magazine. And it really makes me wonder what the heck is going on here when they're talking about being wide awake and then using Benzedrine specifically attached to the name of David M. Kennedy, who's tied in to the Sindona cartel, right?
Yes.
And the Vatican. And I mean, to me, this looks like coded language. I'm just going to be really honest with you. Like, it looks like on January 3rd, 1964, this vast network of people who communicate through the media, we know they do it, had something that they needed to get out into the world about Benzedrine and David M. Kennedy, and this is the clever little way that they did it. I can't think of any other reason that you would formulate a sentence that says Continental's Benzedrine was administered by Chairman David M. Kennedy. People, I'm easy to find. And if you want to send me an email or call me on the phone and tell me why I'm an idiot and why I'm a conspiracy theorist and why it makes sense that Time magazine would write this sentence, my doors are open. And if you can make a better argument, then I will, on my next interview with the Occult Rejects, I will retract what I'm saying here. But I personally can't think of another reason that they would do this. I have to believe that this was coded language involving Continental Illinois, David Kennedy, and amphetamine, the amphetamine trade, right?
Yes, yes. Now, one thing I'm going to insert real quick. So methamphetamines is kind of late to the mind altering game, so to speak, right? Okay. And it was brought into the human zeitgeist when Adolf Hitler used it on the Nazi party or the soldiers to basically march all the way down to Paris very quickly. And this is where we get not Germany awake or whatever you call it, but they were the ones to kind of bring it to the forefront of everyone talking about it because of its extensive use into the Nazis. And they would use it extensively during World War II to try to give them an edge in the war.
Yeah.
That's all I want to say.
Yeah. So I mean, well, look, yeah. So it's another piece of confirming evidence, I would say, that that's what as I look like a cocaine addict as I'm talking about it, right? Like scratching my nose. Sorry about that. But I mean, it's just another confirmation to me, at least, that they just all the pieces interlock, right? Sometimes you do research and you get a piece and you get a piece and they don't. But like these pieces are just like links in a chain, right? And there's not a whole lot of links in the chain left to fill in, I don't think. And that's a really good one. So Kennedy does serve as the Treasury Secretary under Nixon. Nixon ends up firing him. I think that's down here a little bit lower. But while he's on as the Treasury Secretary for a couple of years, he's serving on the National Security Council, and there's nothing weird about that. The Treasury Secretary is always on the National Security Council because it's really important for these types of people to know where their money is, right? So you're going to have your head bankster on your National Security Council. The thing that I thought was interesting is who he was on the National Security Council with, and it turns out that he is on the National Security Council with not just Henry Kissinger, but Richard Helms. And so for those who don't know, Richard Helms is described as the gentlemanly planner of assassinations. So when you're talking about things like Operation Gladio, and you're talking about the CIA and all the coups that they've, I'm going to call committed because it's a crime, what they've done, it's a crime, okay? And so, but the person in charge of a lot of the assassinations to kick off the coups was a man by the name of Richard Helms. And he was serving on the National Security Council at the same time as Mr. Kennedy was, right? So I thought that was pretty interesting. That's the group that he's running with. Another one that caught me a little bit off guard was David Kennedy's connection to Fermilab and CERN. And I have a screenshot of his connection to Fermilab, and then I'll talk about that connection to CERN in a second. But let's just establish that Justin Riggs isn't making things up, but this is actually in the historical record. So this is from like an industry publication that I found in my research, and it's talking about how Illinois is going to have a nuclear accelerator laboratory right here, right? Nuclear accelerator laboratory built in the area. It says a steering committee was organized for the purpose of preparing a proposal to the Atomic Energy Commission advocating Illinois as the site for the accelerator. The group included representatives from the Illinois Department of Business and Economic Development, the Mayor's Committee, then headed by David M. Kennedy, the Chicago Area Research and Development Council, blah, 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 blah. And then it says, preparation of the proposal itself was financed by Commonwealth Edison, Northern Illinois Gas, Continental Bank, and the Illinois Department of Business and Economic Development. So I'm sure you guys know way more about CERN and Fermilab than I do, and I'm happy to stop here and let you sort of educate me a little bit about this. The only thing that I want to point out is that if you're concerned about what's going on, if like those weird occult rituals that are going on at CERN that we know about, and all the things like all this talk about opening up portals that I know nothing, like I know the headlines, I don't know anything about it. If you're concerned about that, you can thank David M. Kennedy for being a part of it, because Fermilab and CERN are very tight partners, and David M. Kennedy is the one who headed up the committee that brought Fermilab to Illinois, okay? So, I don't want to go too deep into the CERN stuff. I enjoy the CERN stories mostly for the entertainment value in terms of the occult. But if there are things that you guys want to, and you want to bring it out about this, I'm more than happy to pause here for a second. Otherwise, I'm just going to move on.
The only thing that I want to say is obviously for the listeners is Fermilab and CERN are particle accelerators and superconducting particle accelerators. It's basically an institute for theoretical physics experimentation, and they are highly funded. I mean, they want not. Fermilab is the particle accelerator or theoretical physics hub for the U.S. The CERN one is the hub for Swiss, and I believe they have a French affiliation as well. One thing that because you had been saying about, we were talking about the German aspect in Chicago and with Mormonism. One of the things that I find weird, because you had brought up Fermilab really quickly, was that it is located, I believe, in Batiba, Chicago or something. That's where it's located. And what's interesting is there was an old Germanic tribe that resided around Germany and Switzerland called the Batibans, or I'm not saying that correctly. So it's interesting that it was established there. I don't know if there's a ley line there or whatever, but basically you say, well, what do? They look at neutrinos, and neutrinos themselves have kind of been a controversial thing. It basically is like new to the game of particle physics. They never knew that neutrinos existed because they exist at such a low molecular weight, or not molecular weight, but
and the Higgs boson, right?
That was another one, the discovery.
Yeah.
And the thing with neutrino research is they basically can map the globe if they want it, well, the Earth, but for the people who don't believe in the globe, they can map the Earth, and they can potentially look for deposits of any kind of like natural resource, or like mining of whether it's for oil or gold or anything like that. They can do stuff like that with neutrino work. They can also, they said that apparently they can look at potential communication with extraterrestrials, as well as look at dark matter, research dark matter. And I mean, the list goes on and on with neutrino research, but it's everything outside of the realm of our possibilities. It was usually just written up in comic books, but you can basically do all that with neutrino work.
Wow. Yeah. So really cool science, right?
Yeah. No,
but you
absolutely.
Got to fund it. You got to fund it.
It's extremely expensive.
They're funding it.
It's extremely expensive.
So that's really fascinating, though. Thank you. Like, I love. I'm really grateful. Like, this is like the conversation is really nice today. I feel like I talk too much. So I really appreciate you.
No, you don't.
Educating me a little bit. Okay, so you were just talking about sort of like fundamental physics, like fundamental particles in physics, right? I want to like pull us back to sort of Kennedy's major thrust, which is the finance world. And I think people would be surprised to find out that Eccles, so it's Kennedy, but it's really it's Eccles through Kennedy, right? His philosophy, at least, maybe not his person. If you go back and you read through, and I haven't been able to go through all of it because there's so much, but I did find this document in David Kennedy's documents where he's asking for a meeting with the President Nixon, because he's planning on a, quote, fundamental but evolutionary change to the world financial system. And we've spent a lot of time talking about Rotary International, and we've spent a lot of time talking about United Nations. The other thing about CERN, before we go on, in that same newsletter that I pulled my screenshot out of, it talks about CERN, and it uses this really weird word about the people working at it. And they say the people working at CERN are what they call planetarians, which really rings like good global citizen to me, right? Of Russell M. Nelson, Skull and Bones, Russell M. Nelson. And so I think, again, like we talk about this sort of vaguely, but like, I think what you're seeing in Kennedy is the continued push for global finance, global government, global religion, global science. Like, it's the globalization. And then I think, what did you call it? The managerial class, right? Yeah, and it's this idea that there's a group of elites who are the ones who should be centrally planning everything for everybody in the world, including David Kennedy planning to fundamentally but slowly change the world financial system. And here's what he says in the letter, part of it. I know you are aware of the sensitivity of some of the material included here, and we have safeguarded copies accordingly. Well, not all the copies, because here we are. Subject to your approval, I believe that the attendance should be kept very limited. The following are now expected to attend: the Secretary of State, Federal Reserve Chairman Martin, Dr. Arthur Burns, Dr. Henry Kissinger, Dr. Paul McCracken, and Budget Director Mayo. And then you've got David Kennedy's signature on that. So again, I'm not much of a financial person, but I think what they're talking about here is taking the United States off of what? Off of gold-backed currency, right? Because for a person like Kennedy and a person like Eccles, tying your currency to something real really gets in the way of your fundamental philosophy of the end of production being consumption, because there's only so much gold in the world. And if you overproduce what can be bought by a gold-backed currency, they think you're going to end up in a depression. And I don't know, I'm not an economist, but okay, you know what? I'm not even going to go there. I just want to point out that the fundamental change being proposed by Kennedy, one of the options being proposed is to get off the gold standard. And sure enough, within a few years, the United States is off the gold standard, and we're now into this helter-skelter world that people like myself have grown up in, where we don't even know what a sound currency is. And all we know is that if somebody produces something, we're supposed to consume it. And if we can't consume it with something that's backed by something real, well, then we should go get some credit from a bank like Continental, Illinois. You know, and it drives me crazy that they call it family banking in that quote up above, because it's about the most anti-family thing I can think of, is consuming beyond your ability to pay for using credit from a bunch of people like David Kennedy and his bunch of yahoos, right?
So was David Kennedy instrumental in getting us on the petrodollar?
I do not have an answer for that question.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, petrodollar is mid 70s, right?
I believe so.
Or late
but
70s.
but there was talks
Would have been
about,
out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So here's the thing. He was only it's okay. He was only in as the Treasury Secretary for a couple of years, and then I'm going to skip one. And I'm going to come back. He actually got replaced. He got fired basically by Nixon, right? And here's the quote that I found about that. It says, Kennedy was nominated by Nixon to be the 60th Secretary of the Treasury. He served from 1969 until 1971. Nixon, who had little interest in economics and expected his top economic advisors to run that portfolio, fairly quickly concluded that Kennedy was not up to the task, being weak both on policy making and as a lead economic spokesman for the administration. Nixon concluded Kennedy was a quote-unquote cipher, and by April 1970 told aide John Ehrlichman that Kennedy was to be replaced.
That's
now,
interesting to say.
That's a whole different rabbit hole, right? So, because you've got people like, is it Tucker Carlson that's saying that Nixon was like the greatest president? And I can't remember if it was Tucker or it was somebody else, one of these major news people, right? And I think there may be a lot more here to this Nixon Kennedy story than I was able to sort of dig out in this couple of weeks of research. But I do know that there's a group of people that really feel like Nixon and his impeachment, which included people like Elder Christofferson, David Christofferson of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was one of the lawyers involved in the impeachment. He was a law clerk for Sirica, is that his name? I think that was part of Watergate, right? And then on the other side of it, though, you had the Bennett family running PR firms that were part of that, and people related to Watergate that had worked for Bennett's PR firm. So anyway, I mean, it's a lot of cloak and dagger, right? And so I don't know what happened like overall, but now we have another piece of the puzzle that for whatever reason, Nixon didn't feel like he understood Kennedy. That's what a cipher means, something that you can't understand, right? And he didn't feel comfortable with him in there, and so he got him out, right? One of the reasons that he may have felt. Go ahead. Yep.
I was just going to insert. I looked it up real quick. Yes, Nixon was in between 1971, 1973, the move to the petrodollar. That's when it all started.
Okay.
Just FYI.
So I think the answer to your question is probably that yes, that Kennedy probably likely was instrumental in beginning that process by bringing to Nixon's attention problems in the current financial system and this desire to fundamentally but incrementally change the world financial system. Okay. So one of the reasons that Nixon may have been uncomfortable with Kennedy is that I actually found that David M. Kennedy was on the attendees list at Bohemian Grove in 1970. Yeah, pretty wild. Now, we talked about several interviews ago about Wilford Woodruff being at the Bohemian Club very early on in Mormon history. And a lot of people always say, well, it wasn't like he went to Bohemian Grove. Well, now we've got somebody who was at the very top of the church, also at Bohemian Grove, right? The owl place, right? The effigy place, right? The place that Nixon apparently, I can't remember the quote, maybe Liza, maybe if you're looking things up while we're doing this, maybe you can look up what Nixon had to say about Bohemian Grove. And maybe when Nixon found out that Kennedy was attending Bohemian Grove the same year that Ronald Reagan was attending Bohemian Grove, by the way, okay? Maybe he just got really uncomfortable with who that was because of the way that Nixon felt about Bohemian Grove, although Nixon himself was at Bohemian Grove, just apparently didn't like it all that much. Okay, let's just,
I
we're
got the
going to have to
quote.
speed up a little bit, I think.
I got the
Okay, go
quote
for
real
it,
quick.
yeah.
It says, "The Bohemian Grove, which I attended from time to time, was the most faggoty, G-damned thing you could ever imagine within that San Francisco crowd." Sorry,
Yeah, I knew it was something
for
like
kids.
that, right?
I censored it. Sorry.
Yeah, all the children, yeah, close your ears.
Yeah.
But so why is David Kennedy at the most faggoty GD, right? Like gathering of people? Well, it's pretty simple. I mean, that gathering is, if you look at the list of attendees, and people have done analysis on this, it's just where all the most powerful financial people go to do faggoty things, I guess. I don't know, like whatever. I don't know why Nixon thought it was that way, but he was there and I was not, so he knows better than I do, and I'm going to take him at his word, that it was what he says it was. Let's move on before my face breaks. So let's just keep looking at different people that David Kennedy was affiliated with. Here's a PR release, right, where Kennedy is going to be awarded the Alexander Hamilton Award, the highest honor of the U.S. Treasury Department. Today was presented to former Secretary of Treasury David M. Kennedy. Who presented it? Treasury Secretary John B. Connally. Who's John B. Connally? Well, John B. Connally is Magic Bullet John B. Connally, who also got shot during the JFK assassination, right? And I am definitely not going to talk about this because I'm going to say something wrong and I'm going to have some JFK conspiracist who will never leave me alone. But let's just know that David Kennedy was tied to John Connally, right? And so when you talk about the Kennedy assassination, this is the crowd that David M. Kennedy is running with, is the John Connallys of the world, okay? So he gets let go as the Treasury Secretary, but he immediately, as all these government people do, gets assigned to another position. And in this case, it's ambassador at large and ambassador to NATO, okay? Which, of course, NATO, we're on the edge of World War III because of NATO, right? And so again, just looking back in history, one of the people that was instrumental in this is David Kennedy as the ambassador to NATO for the United States of America. This is where it gets into the Mormon ties. And so there's a really great paper out there on JSTOR called an LDS International Trio. And I was really familiar with this paper because it talks a lot about Beverly Kennedy. So when I started my research, I was looking at this paper from the perspective of Beverly Kennedy. What I didn't realize when I started my research is that David M. Kennedy was far more important than Beverly Bruff Campbell ever will be. And so the thing I want to point out here is simply that after Kennedy gets done serving in the government and building all of these relationships and being placed in all these positions of power influence and working with the Vatican and the CIA and the banking, the banker of God, God's banker, and all this kind of thing, the president of the church sees an opportunity and he takes it. And the opportunity is to pull David Kennedy inside the church as the church's ambassador at large. Okay, they even give him the same title as he had working for the government. Okay, and this is part of a three-pronged effort of the church to spread the gospel around the world. And I want to just stop and talk about why they needed this for a second. Okay, so the church had been in existence for about, it says right here, 144 years, which is kind of an interesting number, but whatever, 12 times 12, right? 144,000. The church had been proselyting for 144 years, and it was still not making a lot of progress at this time in the early 1970s. And a man by the name of Spencer W. Kimball became prophet of the church, and he was very deeply concerned about the lack of progress in spreading the gospel around the world, because that's part of the prophecies of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is that there's going to be, an eternal kingdom set up, and that in order for that to happen, we have to spread the gospel around the world. That's why we send all of our kids out on missions. So Spencer W. Kimball gets up as in April of 1974 at a regional representative seminar, and according to this article, it says he electrified his audience by outlining an ambitious missionary effort that would take the gospel to all the ends of the earth. Quote, My brethren, I wonder if we are doing all we can, he challenged gently. Are we complacent in our approach to teaching all the world? We have been proselyting now for 144 years. Are we prepared to lengthen our stride, to enlarge our vision? Gordon B. Hinckley, the man who set up the propaganda and intelligence arms of the church, said, "This was the greatest talk ever given in these seminars. None of us can ever be quite the same after that." So what you have is a church that's failing in their divine mandate to spread the gospel around the world. And Spencer W. Kimball sees an opportunity to pull David Kennedy in because he wants Kennedy to open the doors to the nation so that the church can get in and preach the gospel. Now, whether Kimball knew about Kennedy's association with Opus Dei and all that, I think he had to have, but I don't have any documentation to show that. But what you see is the abandonment of traditional proselyting methods and the installation of a secret society. That's not a secret society in the same way that Opus Dei is, but inside LDS Inc., you see the formation of a separate government running alongside the government of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, like the actual church. Okay, and I'm going to show you some quotes that talk directly about that, like right here, okay? So this is not just Justin Ricks saying this. It says right here, though not ordained as a general authority, so he has no authority inside of the church, okay? Kennedy had immediate access to the first presidency of the church, received assignments only from them, and reported only to them. He and Kimball met frequently to examine countries one by one, exploring the possibilities each offered. Kimball advised him to keep the other members of the first presidency updated, but did not stipulate similar briefings for other general authorities. This situation placed Kennedy outside the normal channels of church governance. So it's almost like Kimball was so frustrated with the people who were supposed to be doing this job that he turned to Kennedy to get the job done. And I'll let people draw their own conclusions about what kind of decision, if that's a good decision or a bad decision, right? But I don't think anybody can deny that it happened and that there's now an organization inside the corporation that's running outside of normal channels of church governance in order to achieve church purposes. And I, as a member of the church, just find that incredibly dangerous because everything we're supposed to do inside the church is through revelation. That's why we have prophets, right? We don't need men like David Kennedy to help us accomplish our work because we have a prophet speaking to Jesus Christ who tells us what we do. But unfortunately, for 144 years, what our prophets told us to do wasn't working, apparently. And maybe it was just a patience problem. Anyway, it's neither here nor there. It's all in the history books now. And now you have this sort of secretive organization inside the corporation that's outside the normal channels of church governance. One other really quick thing about Kennedy is that he had deep ties to Asia, which I think is important simply for the fact that we now have our first Council on Foreign Relations apostle, Garrett Gong, whose family is tied into the Hamblin abuse case. But we know that Garrett Gong was introduced into the Council on Foreign Relations, which Kennedy was a part of, and then became an apostle in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I would bet that the Gong family's introduction into the church probably has something to do with Kennedy, although I haven't been able to substantiate it yet. But I do know that it's through that Palo Alto group down with David Haight, right? That's where Gong's mother attended church. So another one that just blew my mind is that I think I brought up Maricopa County several times in our interviews and just how corrupt and what a Mormon stronghold of corruption Maricopa County is. Well, it turns out that David Kennedy took $200,000 from Sindona and invested it in Maricopa County. So he's taking Vatican money, right, or CIA money. I don't know where the money came from, but he's taking money from this banker attached to these groups, and it's $200,000 in 1970s, right? So it's a pretty substantial amount of money, and he's using it in Maricopa County. I went last night, and I have all the documents. There's over 200 documents of David Kennedy investing in real estate in Maricopa County. And I have a feeling that a lot of the corruption that happened in Maricopa County has to do with David Kennedy and another guy. whose last name is Jones. I'm going to forget, but he was an Arizona Supreme Court Justice, Mormon, whose daughter's Ruth Todd, who was a KSL, I think, maybe, was it KSL or another news channel? She was an anchor for a Utah news corporation, but I think it was Jones and Kennedy that were likely setting up a lot of the infrastructure for the corruption that has happened historically and is happening in Maricopa County through the Mormon connection. So I haven't had a chance to go through all 200 documents, but there are a couple that are fairly interesting that, you know, maybe another time I can talk about them, but there's just too much, too many documents to go through. But he's definitely tapped into that Maricopa County stuff. Just to kind of throw this out here, another piece of news that just happened today is that somebody from that Arizona sort of cabal of Mormons, Jeff Flake, just moved to Utah, and now he's going to be in charge of like the World Bank of Utah or something like that. Or like, I can't remember. It's like, people have to go look it up. But this is literally just today that somebody from that Arizona cabal has moved up to Utah, and they've been given a position in one of these sort of international financial positions. So the pipeline moves both ways, right? And people go from Arizona to Utah and Utah to Arizona and so on and so forth. Another Fetzer connection is that part of this international trio is that they set up what's called the International Mission. The important thing to understand about the International Mission is that it was not like any other mission inside of the church in that it was outside of normal channels again. Whoops, I lost it. But you can see here that this particular mission was outside of normal channels. So everything that Monson and Fetzer and Kennedy and Kimball are doing, it no longer has anything to do with the church necessarily, except that they're trying to accomplish religious purposes through secular means, right? You see the name Bangirder here. That's another huge name in Utah. I haven't found many ties actually with the Bangirders, which is a little bit surprising, but there's one. Here's the kinds of things that they were doing as with this international mission. So they set up a mission in Yugoslavia, and here's what this author has to say about that. They drove regularly into the countries of Eastern Europe, visiting and sustaining the faith of scattered members. They also helped supervise a handful of young missionaries who had entered Yugoslavia on student visas in February 1978. These missionaries could not proselyte, but could respond to inquiries. They were to maintain a low profile. As permitted under this unusual circumstance, the missionaries wore casual clothes and let their hair grow to shoulder length. The Warners visited them in Yugoslavia and provided a vital link to Bryant Smith, president of the Vienna Austria mission, under whose direction the young missionaries served. Glenn Warner, humorously reflecting the situation faced by this isolated group of elders, referred to them as the, quote, dirty dozen. And as my mom always told me whenever I told jokes that were mean, there's always a little kernel of truth to every joke you tell, isn't there? And I don't know that setting up a mission in Yugoslavia where you don't have people proselyting and you do have them growing their hair out has as much to do with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as it does with overthrowing communism, personally, especially when you get somebody like David Kennedy operating outside of normal church authority to set these things up. I think it's highly suspect, at the least.
For sure.
So, go ahead.
I want to just another parallel with LDS and Catholic Church. You're talking about their presence in Maricopa, or at least affiliation or whatever. It's one thing, and I know Teresa, if she's still in the chat, she'll back me up on this. So in Graham County, which is about a 4-hour drive, I believe, from Maricopa in Arizona, there is a telescope that is fully funded and has a huge Vatican presence called Lucifer. And they are looking for extraterrestrial life.
I've heard of that. I've never looked into it, but yeah, I've heard of that. I didn't realize that's where it was. That's really interesting. That's where it was. Yeah.
And so you have the Mormon thing, you have the extraterrestrial angle, you have the Vatican angle. It's all kinds of good stuff. Yeah, and
so I think part of my point here is that whether he was sincere or not, at the same time you have David McConkie calling the Catholic Church the whore of Babylon in publications in the church. They have very tight relationships that are very well established at this point. Now, so I mean, there's an open question about, like, Are there factions fighting? Is there a McConkie faction and a Kennedy faction that are fighting inside the church? Or are they just occulting their relationship by calling them the Whore of Babylon, but really behind, under the bleachers, they're making out with each other? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
I think yes to what you're saying, but I think also you are correct in, the whole as above, so below, is that I think that the Mormon church and the Catholic church are factions, and they're both fighting they're jockeying for the lead position in the world religion. And that's why they have started to adopt all kinds of practices and playbooks from all these different types of philosophies and governance, and acting like a cartel and acting like this and acting like that. And they're taking notes from each other just because they're running the race, and they're wanting to be the top dog in the top, whatever, for the world's religion. That's what I think.
Yeah, I mean, it makes as much sense as anything else I've ever heard. I mean, it's the thing that's tragic about it to me is that they use so many good people's lives, and they suck out your time, your talent, your energies, and your resources in this pursuit of salvation, when really they're just in pursuit of power and influence and gain. And that really breaks my heart. It really hurts me.
Yes.
Truly.
And it's sad because I mean they're more focused on the spoils of war, but the war is the collateral damage of the people that they're using.
Yeah, can you imagine? I always say this. Can you imagine being a Mormon apostle who claims to represent the Prince of Peace, who behind the scenes has been in bed with the merchants of war for over 100 years now? Like, how do you sleep at night pretending that you represent the Prince of Peace while you're investing in weapons programs, doing business with like the most wicked, like harmful people on the face of the earth? I don't know how they sleep at night.
Well, and the thing is, they have to. And I'm not, this is by no means an excuse, but they have to, because if they don't, then they will not. It literally is selection of the who can diversify their portfolio and keep ahead. And if they don't, other people will, or other religions and belief systems will, and they won't stay at the top, just like the other ones have. And I think at some point, and Nick and I have talked about this, the tyranny of small decisions, in that someone somewhere made a compromise at some point, and then by the time you knew it, you look back and you see all these compromises that you have made. And I think this happens to all politicians. They get in for all the right reasons, and then at some point they look back and they're like, damn, I made all these concessions and now I'm on this side of the fence.
Too far gone anyway.
Yeah. Well, here's the irony. I love that, by the way. I'm stealing that. The tyranny of small decisions. Yeah. But here's the irony of all that. What is the story of the gospel of Jesus Christ, if not the story of the tyranny of small decisions? Like, hey, Eve, here's a piece of fruit. You shouldn't wait for Father to come back. You should eat it right now. Right. And I see that in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I just see a lack of patience.
Yeah.
And instead of just waiting to receive instruction, they start making these small decisions, and then some not so small decisions of, oh, hey, let's just start a sugar company, even if it bursts the church. Oh, hey, let's bring in David Kennedy, even though he's tied in with like the Whore of Babylon. Oh, hey, let's endorse the mission of the CIA. And the next thing you know, I mean, just all hell's broken loose inside the church.
Correct.
Right? Which I guess is what you would expect, right? So anyway, I love that, though. I'm stealing it, and I apologize in advance for stealing it.
No.
The tyranny of small decisions.
Nice.
All right. I know we're really close to 2 hours, and I hate to keep people much longer than that. So let's just kind of roll through the rest of it, because it's all sort of the same thing. You know, we talked about Beverly Campbell. Beverly Campbell gets pulled in through church broke Ralph Hardy, right? And the reason I put church broke is that Ralph Hardy is best known for a video in which he claims that the church is looking for people who are church broke to work with the corporation, which just means you're going to do whatever they tell you to. You don't have any agency anymore. You've been broken by this group of people who have a secret society inside of the church, despite the fact that they have no revelation to do so. Here's the $200,000 loan. This is the quote about that. And then the thing I want to point out here is simply that somehow after Sindona's banks all collapse, Kennedy testifies at the trial, but he somehow escapes prosecution, although everybody else involved in the Franklin National Bank scandal, everybody else gets prosecuted, but David Kennedy walks, right? So it must be nice.
Yeah.
So Sindona's stuff fails. Then the other thing that's really important to to recognize is that Continental Illinois ends up failing too. So they go from being a bank that is more interested in security and safety to under Kennedy's leadership, getting into this sort of what I would call a casino, really. Like, I think modern banking is more of a casino than anything, right? And eventually, in 84, Continental Illinois is going to fail as well. And guess what happens? The federal government steps in, and that whole too big to fail thing, which I thought started in 2008, was actually coined in 1984 because of Continental Illinois. So you can thank David M. Kennedy and Continental Illinois for this ridiculous system that they have set up where banks are allowed to gamble with the money of American families. And when they screw up, they're now too big to fail. So the government comes in and props them up and blows the bubble up a little bit bigger, right? So that we don't have to suffer the immediate pain. But we're going to have a real big crack boom at some point, aren't we? And a lot of that is because of David M. Kennedy and the people that he worked with at Continental Illinois. Okay, so too big to fail, too big to fail. We're going to skip Beverly Bruff Campbell for today. Just the only thing I'd point out is that Sergeant Shriver's name was attached to Kennedy, and then Campbell's name is attached to Shriver. So it's a very short leap to understand why Beverly Bruff Campbell got brought in, along with her husband, likely CIA asset, Arwell Pierce Campbell. Here's the too big to fail on Continental Illinois, so that people can know I'm not making it up. It's actually from the Federal Reserve history, saying that Continental Illinois was a bank that was too big to fail. There's a story about Kennedy being asked to attend a meeting with a Russian diplomat that includes Russell M. Nelson and Beverly Bruff Campbell. We're going to skip over that because I don't think there's anything really too surprising about that. But just anywhere that they needed Kennedy's sway or pull, they were going to try to pull him into those meetings. Another unusual situation associated with Kennedy that should have been church related, but ends up being part of this sort of Mormon Opus Dei group, right, is they sent a bunch of missionaries through that international mission over to Africa. And it just says that it was an unusual farewell because it was the first presidency that was there, James E. Faust and Assay, and David Kennedy. Even though he doesn't have a calling in the church, he's not a general authority, he's here at this special or unique or unusual missionary farewell. And it was a really successful mission. They sent some couples over to Africa. And by the time they returned after a year, they had 1,700 new members in what he calls Black Africa. And it's places like Ghana and Nigeria, right? And I mean, if I'm being honest with you, I'm really worried about what's happening in Africa and with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints right now, but that's neither here nor there, nor any of my business anymore. But I don't think the people of Africa know what they've gotten into by opening the doors of their country to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints personally. Kennedy dies in 1996. And then, I like to always pull this back to the church because I have dreams that at some point members of the actual Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, not the corporation, not LDS Inc., but members of the actual church will actually look at these presentations. And so I always like to pull it back to questions for Mormons because I think there are questions they need to be asking as they decide whom they should affiliate with, support, and sustain. And this is a little bit, it's actually a little bit esoteric in the sense that inside the church, they have what are called priesthood keys. And look, there's like an entirely different show that we could do about this with somebody that I think you guys actually know. She has a podcast. It's Heidi Love. And she has some really interesting research about what priesthood keys actually are because of Joseph Smith's involvement in Solomonic magic and esoteric Freemasonry. Here's the point that I want to make. Growing up in the church for 45 years, there's a big joke in the church because we talk about having these keys all the time, but if you ask in a church meeting for somebody to explain what the keys are, everybody just kind of looks at each other because nobody wants to tackle that question because nobody really knows. And even the things that the leaders of the church say publicly don't really make a ton of sense. Here's the only thing I want Mormons. If you're a Mormon and you end up watching this for whatever reason, I just want you to ask yourself this question. In the Temple Recommend Questions, it used to say, do you sustain the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as the prophet, seer, and revelator, and as the only person on the earth who possesses and is authorized to exercise all priesthood keys, whatever those priesthood keys are and whatever they do. After these occult secret society members and these powerful banksters get a hold of the church and kind of, in my opinion, like take it in a direction that it shouldn't have gone, they end up changing that temple recommend question. And it says now, do you sustain the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as the prophet, seer, and revelator, and as the only person on the earth authorized to exercise all priesthood keys? So stick with me here for just 1 second. Let's just say that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the actual top dog, and that when Jesus Christ comes back, if he comes back, the first person he's going to go visit is the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And let's say that there are these keys, these priesthood keys that had been given to church leaders that they possessed at one point. How come the word possess is no longer a part of this temple recommend question? And why am I, as a member of the church, no longer asked to state whether or not I believe that they possess these keys? Okay? There are a couple different logical explanations for this. And it's a little bit into Mormon theology. So again, I just ask you to bear with me just for fun, just in case a Mormon ever comes along and watches this. One option is that some of the meetings that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, some of those meetings that they claim are going to happen, like meetings with Adam, like Adam and Eve Adam, where the church's prophet is going to turn over the keys to Adam so that he can turn them over to Christ so that Christ can return. Maybe those meetings have already happened, and the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints no longer possess those keys. But maybe because they chose to start a sugar company and endorse the mission of the CIA and set up a shadow government inside the corporation that stole the name of the church, maybe they just don't possess those keys at all. Here's the thing that I know. I'm a father who has children old enough to drive, and I have keys that I can give to my children that allow them to utilize the power of that vehicle. I can authorize my children to utilize those keys, but if they don't possess those keys, they ain't going anywhere with my car. And if the prophets of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints don't possess the keys anymore, even if they're authorized to exercise them, I don't know what good that does, because in order to get the church to go where it needs to go, you have to possess the keys and not just be authorized to use the keys. Hey, Nick, I authorize you to use the keys for my Jeep Cherokee that's sitting outside. Who cares? You're in New York and I'm in Tennessee, and your authorization means nothing. You need to possess those keys.
Well, the one thing I
So
do
for all
even
go ahead.
want to add to this too, I mean, you could look at this in so many ways too. I would assume, this is just my opinion, if there's occultism behind this, you know, those keys are going to mean something, you know, very deep, I think. And it's like, is the person that they're even saying has those keys even understand exactly what that symbol even means too? Like,
I keep saying that this is going to be my last interview.
But I don't know. I just even think when it comes to the keys,
I think I interrupted you. I think I blipped out, and so I apologize for interrupting.
It's okay. No, I'm just saying, even when it comes to the key stuff, I even think that, like, maybe even under this understanding what they're even talking about, that might be incorrect for a lot of people. That could just literally just be an occult label to give somebody, you know, of standing, of what they understand and what they experienced.
I think Heidi Love is making a pretty good case. She's been doing a lot of research about this, and this idea of Joseph Smith engaging in folk magic, I think, is probably the actual occult leaders of the church trying to cover up what was actually going on there. Because when you look at what Joseph Smith was doing, when you look at the artifacts that he had, when you look at the seer stones, when you look at was it the Jupiter talisman, I believe it was, or I can't remember if it's Jupiter, so I always get it mixed up. But he has a talisman, he has a Mars knife, when he has, and like all that Solomonic magic and all of that esoteric Scottish Rite Freemasonry is all about what? It's all about binding angels and demons, right, in the pursuit of whatever it is that you find most important. And it involves keys, doesn't it? So this is not my area of expertise. I'm trying to learn a little bit more about it, but because I've never practiced as far as Joseph Smith. But I think you're right, Nick. I think it could be that those keys have something really important.
And I'm not going to try to think of the nicest way to say this. My opinion, I think there's a better chance that these keys refer back to the eyeballs in the brain. That's just my opinion. So again, like even different levels of understanding. What if what you're saying is incorrect and I'm actually right, but I could be completely wrong. Now there's a complete misunderstanding of what the keys even are.
Yeah. Yep, and I mean that goes into temple ritual too.
No,
right?
no.
So,
Well,
like,
I mean, no. See, I can sit down in a chair and not do a ritual, and I can twist those keys and I can do things. I don't have to do all that shit. So you know what I'm understanding? What am I getting at? Like, I myself, I would like to claim, yeah, I put the keys in my eyes and I play fucking games all the time. I unlock doors all the time, but I'm not doing crazy ritualistic sick shit. So there's a misunderstanding of what those keys might actually mean to some people who haven't had an experience. So then you don't know what those keys even mean when you're making a comment on what they're associated with. You know what I'm saying? And that trickles down into society and understanding of what's even being said or done. That's what I'm saying. Even the person they're claiming has the keys may not even know what the fuck that means either.
Yeah.
They could be an idiot puppet because the occultists understand what it means. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not trying to, you know, it's just there's many different levels of understanding. And I think the lower the higher up you go, the more you realize there's something a little bit more going on here. That's all.
I will say, if I may interject, and please correct me if I'm wrong, and obviously in the comments and later on, please correct me because I'm learning, is that some of the work that Nick and I did into grimoires is the lesser key and the greater key of Solomon kept coming up, and those are grimoires, which by definition are books of spells, magic, what have you, right? Is colloquially said to be, right? That they're, I didn't say that right, but you know what I mean. Yeah. And so I think originally if you look at historically, the original way that the Key of Solomon was written was clavicle of Solomonis, right? And clavicle in Spanish means key. And so maybe they just bastardized the word key as the Key of Solomon. This is just my understanding or my whatever. But the actual grimoire itself was supposedly a Judeo-Christian text combining both religions and looking at the esoteric form or the mystical form of Judaism and Christianity, which, I mean, let's just be honest, there is a lot of mysticism going on in Judaism as well as Christianity, but that is not at all espoused in the regular people. That stuff is more for the higher ups or stored in a shelf somewhere in the Vatican or in the recesses of some, synagogue. It is not practiced.
Which is where Utah keeps all of its documents. Yeah.
Right. It is not at all for dispersal amongst the normal people or the lay people, right? But those grimoires were actually kept by mystics, and it's where a majority of grimoires, and the grimoires are extensive. It's a majority of where most of the grimoires come from is these the lesser Key of Solomon. And please correct me if I'm wrong, because I believe that's kind of where most of the research was pointing towards, and even more so the Judeo-Christian texts, and then even some of the lesser Key of Solomons all have Arabic origins. So you look at potentially, those religions taking from some of the religions coming out of the East as well. And so it's a combination of a lot of things kind of put together in text because it worked. Let's just be honest. That's why it was done, and that's why it was practiced. And so when you have these, whether the whole keys appearing in the narrative text or whatever, again, you see how potentially the Mormon belief system or some of the playbooks are tapping in or sticking their finger into Christian and Judeo mysticism as well, because it worked for them as well. And so to what extent, I don't know. I'm not there. I'm not practicing or anything like that. I'm barely getting my feet wet with some of this stuff. But I think that that's probably their attempt to also tap into some of this esoteric knowledge, because let's just be honest, it's there. It's just a matter of studying it and learning it and what have you.
Another thing I even wanted to add too, and this might be a little bit off, but I mean, you never know. And like, excuse me, I'm sorry that I'm comparing it to a cult. It just is what it is. But I've known like other cult, like a cult called Fellowship of Friends. And I know other occult practitioners that have, I'm not going to start naming them, but whatever. Other people that have been known to even been playing specific, what's music arranged by? Keys, sounds. They were playing specific keys at specific times of the month, especially when they were doing musicals part of the day, because they knew it was fucking tapping into their head more and they could push shit in. So, I mean, even when it comes to keys and it comes to manipulating people, that could be such a multi-layered fucking saying. You know what I'm saying? Like, who knows where that can go? Because that even could be like another big thing with the Mormon church is fucking those organs, isn't it? Don't you guys all have organs? And there's a Mormon company that makes organs. They understand sound if they're fucking replicating those old organs.
If you get into cymatics.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is a huge part of occultism and mysticism of Christian and Jewish faith back in the 1100s. So again, I would definitely, if you're looking at this, look at it from a lens of no judgment. Anything on the board, just try to uncover it. And just looking into it doesn't mean that you yourself are going to adopt it or that you're going to be practicing it. If anything, you are seeking information. And that's not a way to kind of pacify or whatever. But I mean, I think they work on the occult aspect. If you hear the word occult, immediately you think the devil, Satan, all whatever. I don't want to look into it. I don't want to tap into it. And
that works out perfect because then the buck stops staying. You don't look anywhere else.
Right. And those people get to keep the knowledge and no one's looking into it. Or they work on fear, which we all know the propaganda of fear sells. And so a lot of these, I guess, avenues of knowledge go unlooked into, I don't know, so to speak, because of that.
Here's the thing for me about this. So the book of Revelation, what is the word that revelation was translated from? It's apocalypto, right? And it means hidden. So here's the dangerous thing, right? God occults things. There are mysteries that God does not intend human beings to know if there is a God. For those of, look, that's an open question, but if we're not seeking intelligence, and the claims of most religions and the claim of Mormonism certainly is that their keys are the ones that will turn the ignition and that will power you to where you want to get to.
Oh, definitely will.
The Catholic Church claims the same thing, as do the Muslims, so
we're working with gas.
And this is where I come down on it, is if there is a God, and I believe there is, the only way to come to know God is to seek as much intelligence as possible and learn how to discern that which will bring you what you most desire. I think, unfortunately, in the case of the Mormon Church, based on my research, what they most desired was power, influence, and gain inside of the world. And then that tyranny of small decisions has added up to a place where you now have a skull and bones prophet telling people all kinds of crazy stuff, right? And so, we all are engaged in trying to unveil things. Every single human being that comes here, because there's much that's mysterious. And so we have to be extremely careful about what we accept into our lives and how we go about that process of de-occulting things, right? And so, but the answer to me is not shutting down the flow of information or burning books or banning people from talking to each other, right? The answer is learn how to exercise your faculties of logic and reason, right? Explore as much as you can. And when you run up against the wall, turn to that higher power that you believe is there and see if you can get in tune with that somehow, right? Lots of ways to do that. Some have really good outcomes short term, really bad outcomes long term. I hate to see people walking down a path that's going to lead to bad long term outcomes,
Yeah, I would agree. It's perfectly stated.
What were you what happened with the slides and stuff? It fell down, it came out. Did you want to put that back up, or were you done? Yeah. Because I think you said you lost it.
That was the end for me. That was, the last thing.
That was the end anyway? Okay, all right. My bad. I thought I figured you still had more.
No.
But one of the things, and again,
I try to keep it to 2 hours so that people don't.
No, that was perfect. Yeah.
No, and I wanna also insert this because I didn't know much once I started this journey in terms of what all this meant, and it seemed like a majority of these people, regardless of what walk of life or belief system they were doing, whether it was good or bad, everyone wanted to somehow bridge the gap or reach across the abyss and get in contact with supernatural. Whether it was a good supernatural, whether it was a bad supernatural, but they were trying to reach across. And if anything, the main theme of that is that there is a supernatural.
Yeah, well,
That
everybody
everyone
believes
is
that there is
trying
at
to
least.
reach over.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's the common belief, really.
That's the common belief system. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, no, I agree. And again,
That's a really good
I mean,
point.
and this may just be my Mormon upbringing, but I mean, I think the thing that always just, I mean, so certainly like, I mean, in the Mormon church, why do we baptize dead people? Like, and okay, wait, let's be really careful. For anybody who doesn't know what I'm talking about, baptisms for the dead is proxy baptisms. We don't take cadavers and baptize. Okay, let's not have that conversation. But why do we do these baptisms for the dead? It's because we believe in a supernatural existence beyond this existence, and that we believe that these people have to partake of that ordinance in order to gain salvation. So, but I think you're right, Lisa. I mean, the thing that's always driven me crazy about how religions fight with each other is that they all seem to be trying to accomplish the same thing, which is to heal the hurt, right? And to establish connection and relationship with each other and God.
Right.
And yet somehow, despite the fact that we all have the same aim, we all end up going in wildly different directions. And I don't know how to solve that problem. And I don't think any human being is ever going to be able to solve that problem. So the really critical thing for me is how do we, while we're all working this out, how do we not kill each other? Because I'm really tired of watching people kill each other.
Yeah.
Can we not just like try to heal our own hurt and find our own wisdom without pointing a gun at the people who don't believe the same way we do and taking them out because we think that somehow they're in the way of us healing?
I do. I think the hurt comes from being detached from source, and you don't know how to make heads or tails of it, right? You come here and the lessons are whatever. And the thing is that I think what religion is in the business of is being the middleman. They somehow want to be the go-to or the bridge or what have you, right? The way, the path forward. And that's fine. I think that's great. However, once they start fighting amongst each other, then we get in the crosshairs and they use us as political pawns or pawns on the chessboard, and it's collateral damage from there on out. But again, it still goes back to the fact that if anything, I think the main takeaway, and not to take away your thunder, but the main takeaway is that we are important. Us as people with souls, we are still important, because you have these religious factions fighting over membership. Everybody wants a membership to their religious order, right? Whether it's for money or whether it's popularity, it doesn't matter. But at the end of the day as well, like I just said, that there is a supernatural, and they're wanting to keep their position in the middle of you and that.
I love that. I couldn't say it any better. And I think Mormonism is no different than any of these other, at this point, if it ever wasn't that, at this point, if you're a member of the actual Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the one that was named that because of Revelation, you are just a pawn on a board being utilized by men who have other goals in mind right now. And so because you are important, like Liza said, I'm just, again, pleading with people who are a part of that organization. I'm not telling you not to be a part of it.
Oh.
You can choose, but I'm telling you, be vigilant and be careful, because the minute that you cross the brand, you're no longer brother or sister Riggs. You are now a human resource that needs to be dealt with so that the brand can continue to bring in new members. Right. And that's really sad. It hurts my heart to have to say that, but that is my lived experience, and it's also what all of the evidence in my research points to.
One thing I do want to add, I don't want to I should have just left it there, but another thing I want to add too with what you were saying, I would just even think of the simple fact if the CIA is involved, it's very much like Lisa was saying, trying to keep you and the paranormal connected in a sense, because they seem to be around a lot of stuff that would be considered paranormal. So, I mean, even just the CIA being there, I think that's going to be an issue. So, something else to think about, I think. Justin, thank you very much, man. That was another great episode.
Thank you.
Tons and tons and tons of information. And I think, again, you strung it along well to show a connection, or, a solid theory, in my opinion. You want to let everybody know where they can find your stuff again?
You betcha. So it's just at LDS Abuse on Twitter is the main place to find me. And then the website is https://ldsabuse.info.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I will make sure that those links, they're probably in the bottom now. If not, I'll make sure they're there. And when the episode drops, that will be in the show notes as well. So go check out all his work. Lisa, was there anything that you would like to say or anything?
Justin, thank you so much for sharing your incredible research with us. And it is always, always such a great time to listen to all of the research you've compiled, because I feel at some point it takes the work that Nick and I have done, as well as other people, and we're piecing the puzzle together. That's how I feel most of your research. It's the missing piece that, we couldn't find on the table. And thank you very much for that. And if it also, just as a side plug, that if you wanted to read more about some of the stuff that we've been doing and some of the collaborators on the Occult Rejects, there is an enormous amount of people contributing to Occult Research Institute. And the topics are everything from, mind manipulation to biology to old occultists or mystics or anything like that. And that is at occultresearchinstitute.org. And hope you check it out.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And that is the end of another Occult Rejects. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.